Well, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, queridos amigos, well, first of all, let me apologize because all this area around Temple and the Strand, we've had problems with our internet supplier the whole day, but well, apparently the problems are over now, so I hope you're all connected. We had, in fact, gathered a very huge audience for this hybrid event. So, well, after this apology, please let me welcome you all to yet another installment of the Nigel Glendinning lectures, which ARTES and the Instituto Cervantes hold every March to celebrate Spanish and Latin American art, and of course, the memory of the great Hispanist. We are honored to have Professor Elizabeth Cowling with us today. She's just arrived from Edinburgh. And we're all very thankful, Professor, for your availability, and are very much looking forward to hearing you, to listen to you on your talk about Juan Gris and his collage. This month of March has not been easy. We're still mourning Sir John Eliot's passing, and if someone is unaware of this, it might be worth it to underline the fact that he was the honorary chairman of ARTES. And the passion for Spanish and Latin American art, he kept it until the very end, because it was only last December that I had the privilege to wheel him through the excellent exhibition on Peru at the British Museum. And I still was very much surprised that such an elderly gentleman could still have such a passion for the art and yes, and the exhibition itself. So this will also be, and it's a small announcement, dear friends, my last Glendinning lecture. I am being posted to Rome in September, and I have to thank ARTES and the chairmen we have worked with, Piers Baker Bates and Nicola Jennings, for the fruitful collaboration we have undertaken in these last few years, and which I am sure will carry on even stronger in the future. I will not forget to mention our collaboration with the Zurbarán Center and the Spanish Gallery. In fact, this Glendinning lecture is part of the Zurbarán Center seminars. All these organizations and institutions bear witness to a fact that has been extremely rewarding to observe: the growing passion for Spanish and Ibero-American art in the UK during these last few years, as shown also in the exhibitions on Picasso, Goya, Sorolla, and Bartolomé Bermejo, among others, and also in the upcoming exhibition with the title, I think, Visions from Spain, from the Hispanic Society in the US, that will be I think it will start in January 2023. So this will also be a very important event for spreading the word about Spanish art in the UK. This is all from me, dear friends. I leave now the floor to Dr. Piers Baker Bates and to Professor Elizabeth Cowling. Many thanks, and I wish you all a very inspiring evening. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Ignacio. You've in fact taken the words out of my mouth about both Sir John and Nigel Glendinning. If I may ask a personal reminiscence to what Ignacio said, there's something of a Groundhog Day, I think, because the last in-person event I went to was the Glendinning lecture in 2020. And the sense of status of the last 2 years, so it is a great celebration for us to be all, the few of us are here in person. It is a great pleasure. Ignacio has said much of what I intended to say. I would like to add two things. ARTES' own tribute to Sir John, which will be more full at our AGM, and I'd also extend a personal thanks to Ignacio, who has been such a great friend and supporter during our time, and whom we will strongly miss as a presence for ARTES. But without further ado, with one parish notice first, for those of you online, I'd just like to draw attention to the fact to the awards for travel and scholarship that ARTES award to postgraduate students. The deadline for them is next Thursday, which is the 31st. With that parish notice, let me proceed to the most important business of the evening, which is to introduce our extremely distinguished speaker, Professor Elizabeth Cowling, who is Emeritus Professor at the University of Edinburgh, and will, I hope, be familiar to many of our audience. She's an expert on 20th century art, and in particular on Picasso. But when we asked her to speak tonight, she said anything but Picasso. So we are hearing about Juan Gris. Many of you will know Elizabeth's publications, but I shall just reiterate for those who don't. She published Picasso Style and Meaning in 2002, and most recently Picasso Portraits in 2016. But what Elizabeth is best known for is her many Picasso exhibitions. Picasso Sculptor Painter at the Tate in 1994, Matisse Picasso in 2002-2003 at the Tate, at the Pompidou, and MoMA in New York, and Picasso Looks at Degas in 2010-2011, which was at the Clark Art Institute. And the lecture she'll give us tonight about Juan Gris is particularly exciting because it is a foretaste of the exhibition she will be opening in October 2022 at the Metropolitan Museum, which is co-curated with Dr. Emily Braun and will be entitled Cubism and the Trompe Tradition. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. So, can you do the technology you promised?
I did. My apologies for that slight technical hitch, as they said on the BBC in my childhood. There we are.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to give this lecture, and apologies for not speaking about Picasso. Could we have the light down a little bit, actually? I think, no, not a good idea. We'll try it. Anyway, it is a great honor to be giving this lecture for ARTES. Nigel Glendinning with his fame. But I ought to begin really by making two apologies. First of all, although Juan Gris was, of course, Spanish, he spent most of his working life in France. He left Spain in 1906 and never returned. So everything that I'm going to be showing you was actually created in France, practically all of it in Paris. And in a way, I mean, he towards the end of his life anyway, he had a kind of love-hate relationship with his home country. Furthermore, another apology, the things that I'm going to be talking about, the comparisons I'm going to be making, that's wonderful, actually, thank you. The comparisons I'm going to be making are not with great works of art in the Louvre, which of course he attended, he went to the Louvre often, and he was interested in old master painting. But I'm going to be taking you into hardware shops and department stores in Paris instead. We're going to be seeing the low side of art. Now, that's not working. This is classic. So can I not use this? That should work now. Yeah, okay, thank you. These two collages were exhibited in October 1912 in the Salon de la Section d'Or in Paris, the watch and the wash basin. They weren't the first collages to be produced. Picasso's Still Life with Chair Caning on the left, which incorporates an offcut of printed oilcloth, was created in May 1912, and Braque probably made the first papier collé in September 1912. And that, the one on the right, he always said was his very first. But the two works by Gris were the first actually to be shown in public. And today, what I'm going to do is to discuss a handful of his Cubist collages and to explore the impact of the cut and paste technique and process on his concept of still life. Still life was the genre which dominated his work throughout his entire career, from his beginnings as a painter in 1909 to 1910 to the end of his life in 1927, when he died at the age of 40. But I just wanted to say a few words about his beginnings. And this is one of the few early photographs we actually have of him, taken in probably 1913, published in Guillaume Apollinaire's Les Peintres Cubistes. extraordinarily, there is no full dress biography of Gris yet. And we know very little about his early life, except that his childhood was an very comfortable middle-class childhood, financed by his father's successful fancy goods and paper stationery shop in Madrid. But at some point, the business went bust, and there was not sufficient money in the family to support his career, his wish to become a painter. And so rather than going to an art college, he, at the age of 15, in 1902, he enrolled in the Escuela de Artes y Manufacturas in Madrid, where he would have been taught technical drawing and probably the rudiments of industrial design. In 1904, he did take classes with an academic painter, and we don't even really know who the painter was, but he couldn't pursue the dream of becoming a painter because there was no money in that. So he went into a career of illustration, and his first commissions as an illustrator date from 1904, 1905, still very young, just in his late teens. And he was working for satirical magazines and also books of poetry, of contemporary poetry. And it was that way, as an illustrator, that he earned his living for the next 8 years until 1912. After he moved to Paris in 1906, he started working for leading French satirical magazines. And I'm going to show you a few of those illustrations later. And I think this background is very important, this technical training, this commercial background, commercial art rather than fine art. And I also think that although we know so little about his father's business, the idea of a stationery shop with a young child full of paper, lots of different papers, surely that influenced his attitude to collage, where he is using paper, lots of different papers, and he always used a very much larger range of papers than the other Cubists. Now, even before moving to Paris in the autumn of 1906, he had abandoned his birth name, José Victoriano González, and he was signing his work with the name that we now know him by, Juan Gris. And it's often been pointed out that the word gris in French and in Spanish is the same, means gray, of course, but the pronunciation is different. In 1907, Gris took a studio in the squalid, ramshackle artists' colony, well known as the Bateau Lavoir, the laundry boat in Montmartre, which was tenanted at the time in 1907 by Picasso, by other Spanish and also by Catalan artists, but also a totally international collection of artists, all of whom were impoverished. And when I say it was squalid, it really was squalid. There was one lavatory for the entire building of about 40 studios. And it was there in the Bateau Lavoir that his future dealer, who became a very close friend, Daniel Henry Kahnweiler, observed him, and this is a quotation, ardently learning the trade of a painter by drawing and painting still lives, and this is again a quote, with modesty and conscientiousness. And the drawing on the left is from 1910, really very much the beginning of his efforts to become an artist, his desire, while at the same time financing himself by his illustration work. Now, I don't know whether Gris, in his sort of teach yourself approach, actually consulted instruction manuals on painting. But according to Camille Bélanger, a page from whose book I'm showing in the center of the slide here, a composition consisting of just a few ordinary objects set up on the corner of a table was the proper starting point for a novice artist who ought to doggedly keep on drawing and eventually painting the same commonplace things until he'd gained mastery of contour, modeling, lighting effects, and eventually color. Would have all been in black and white originally. And until he was capable of representing those objects realistically, only then could he consider tackling more complex subjects. And I'm showing that illustration because I think it's interesting as a kind of model for the compositions which you find in many, many Cubist works, but also particularly in Gris. This painting is slightly later in 1910, where he's actually moved away from drawing. Now, Gris used to refer to Picasso as his master. And by 1911, Cubist multiple viewpoint was beginning, and fragmentation and monochrome was beginning to exert a visible influence on his painting. And you see that on the picture, in the picture on the left from early 1911, which I'm comparing with a Picasso of 1909, the kind of painting that he would certainly have seen because Picasso still had a studio in the Bateau Lervois. But the geometry underpinning slightly later works from 1911 by Gris, which the one on the left I'm showing you, jar, bottle, and glass, is much more obvious than you find than the geometry in a work by Picasso, for example, like this. You can see very much that it's constructed on the basis of a geometric grid, vertical, horizontal, diagonal. And I think that very systematic use of geometry can be connected by us with the technical training that he received. And I'm making comparisons here with publications, French publications, which I found online, which show the use of grids, vertical, horizontal, diagonal grids, the use of geometry for the representation of ordinary objects, daily objects, and then the kinds of tools that the technical draftsman would have to use, compasses, rulers, etc., geometric tools. And these are the kinds of tools that Gris would have learned to use as a teenager before he moved to Paris. And it's interesting that conservators have found pinpricks in his oil paintings, which indicate the use of compasses. And we know that his paintings were preceded by very careful drawings, most of which Gris chose to destroy later in life because he wanted to hide what he thought of as the mechanical process of his work. So these illustrations, I think, give an idea of the kind of thing that he would have seen as a boy. Now, the greatest difference between jar, bottle, and glass, the 1911 painting, and the first collage I'm going to look at, the wash basin of 1912, of October 1912, is in the degree of realism. Just a year separates these two works. The geometric grid that controls the wash basin, the composition of it, is just as explicit as that of the earlier painting. And it looks as though Gris was using a compass to draw the circular elements in the wash basin. But now the objects and the setting are very particularized. They're not so abstracted or generalized or generic as they are in this painting on the right. And things from the real world are now beginning to replace hand-painted representations. In the case of the wash basin, the mirror towards the top right of the painting is actually created with pieces of mirror glass, real mirror glass. And some of the labels here are actually real labels. I can't be very explicit about how many of them, because that collage hasn't been seen in public for 50 years, and there aren't any decent high-resolution photographs of it. So I'm using a pretty grainy photo. But he's beginning to use products. And to give you an idea of the kind of packaging that Gris used in later collages, I'm just showing you a handful of details from works from 1914, where there are coffee packets, things to do with cigarettes and tobacco, cigarette papers, etc. He was we're told by Kahnweiler, totally addicted to coffee, and he smoked constantly. So these were the products that Gris was using, and he's using the packaging and the labels from the things that he's actually used. You could see him in a way as doing some product placement in these works. Now, the descriptive style of the wash basin, the hand-painted parts of it, the curtain, the jug, the ewer, the basin, etc. The descriptive style is neither academic nor photographic, but it's of the formulaic and simplistic kind of style of representation that's typical of contemporary advertising and commercial art. The realm with which Gris was absolutely familiar. So I'm just making a series of comparisons with an advertisement for a sort of washing, sort of plumbing, salle de bain, cabinet de toilette, 1905, that comes from a catalogue. Here in the middle, the Printemps magazine, the Printemps shop in Paris, where you've got a series of ewer and basin sets, which are really extremely like what you see in Gris's work. And then in terms of sort of products, the kind of accoutrements that you see in on the tabletop of the cabinet de toilette, here's the kind of thing that you're actually seeing represented in the painting here in a Félix Potin advertisement, a lithographic advertisement from the 1890s, where of course you have a woman at her mirror doing her makeup, a subject which lies behind this, this collage. So I think what you've got, it's something quite extraordinary going on in a way. Collage itself had been a popular domestic craft for a long time, particularly practiced by women in the 19th century. And so what Gris is doing is deliberately courting the ordinary, the banal, the world of advertisements, etc., and the world of domestic craft, collage, and combining that with the sort of strange, elite, arty style of Cubism. And this Cubist sort of analytical strategies. So this was a kind of marriage of opposites, if you like, which astonished and shocked most of the critics at the time. His use of collage was highly controversial. Coming back to this pairing with which I started, both of these works presuppose a human protagonist. These things belonged to somebody. And this is what I really want to emphasize when I talked about, when I gave the title, The Environment of Collage. You've got a still life subject matter, but an environment is created through the use of found materials that come from the real world and from the very familiar and banal real world of the department store and the hardware shop. You don't see any human beings in any of Gris's still lives of this Cubist period, but they presuppose a human protagonist who is there in the background, as it were. And as we'll see, not only that, but stories start entering into his works through kind of implication and through the materials that actually are introduced in his work. And he takes us into the kind of hybrid territory of still life, which is really a kind of form of genre painting, as a mixture. And both these works, you see, have a kind of theatrical setting, a pulled back curtain that reveals the scene beyond, that might almost be a theatrical setting. Now, although this is very rarely mentioned in the literature, in fact, never mentioned in the literature, it would be fair to say, gender is a recurrent issue in Gris's collages. And the cabinet de toilette in the wash basin evidently belonged to a woman. There's no shaving equipment anywhere in it. It's all to do with sort of female possessions. The flowers decorating the pink curtain, which is pulled back, would have been considered feminine at the time. Mirrors are traditionally associated with female vanity, as we see in the Félix Potin illustration, the poster that I've already shown you. So this is speaking woman. The owner of this cabinet de toilette is a woman. And women preening at their toilet tables appear in several of Gris's cartoons, such as the one I'm showing you here from 1910, from the satirical magazine L'Indiscret, where really the setup is very similar. Now, this, in other words, the territory that is being explored in the wash basin, it was familiar to Gris from his advertising or his cartoons for satirical magazines, where there were a lot of advertisements, of course, on the back pages. But in these drawings, there would have been, or there were, they were accompanied by sort of worldly wise commentaries and jokes, the cynical kind of satirical commentary about the infidelities of women, prostitution, and so on. That's a particular theme of his illustrations. Now, when we come to the watch, however, we're now in the realm of men, because that's clearly a man's watch and chain, not a woman's fob watch. The curtain, you notice, has got no flowers on it. And you have in the background here a very abstracted version of a globe and a table strewn with books, which include cuttings from the poems of Apollinaire, which he had taken from the magazine Les Soirées de Paris, where these poems were actually published for the first time. The poems are L'Enfer and Le Pont Mirabeau, and I put a cutting from Le Pont Mirabeau at the bottom. You can't really see them easily in my slide, but those cuttings are there on the backs of the books. And I'm making a comparison this time with two works by Vermeer, an artist who interested Gris very much, because he was very interested in Dutch painting, where the kind of scene is really, it seems to me, not very different from what is being depicted by Gris in the watch. And of course, instead of a woman preening herself at her wash table, in her cabinet de toilette, here you have the intellectual world of men, scientists, geographers, etc. It's a different kind of vision. And clearly, the man who owned these accoutrements and this globe and so on had women on his mind, because both those poems by Apollinaire are about the pain of lost love. So although it's a man's world, he's thinking of women. And this kind of erotic subtext is frequent in his collages, in Gris's collages. And at the time, he could probably have expected some of his audience, at least, to know those poems by Apollinaire. The bottle of sherry, of course, is like being Spanish, is a kind of signature, a sort of form of self-advertisement, you might say, as a Spanish artist. Now, again, making comparisons with the sort of popular sources that I think are interesting in relation to Gris's work. Here, this kind of chromolithograph by the designer Nicolas Glaise, published in the 1880s, these large-scale, very large chromolithographs that were published intended for interior decorators and for the kind of trompe-l'oeil painters who produced kind of replicas as decoration in houses, etc. So I think alongside the textbooks for technical draftsmen, the advertisements, the commercial brochures, I think he also drew upon, while forming his workmanlike style of representation, these kinds of lithographs published for painter decorators as models, published in France between the mid-19th century and the outbreak of the First World War. And here his introduction to this material might well have been Georges Braque, who was a close friend of Gris's, because both Braque's father and grandfather were house painters. And Braque himself was trained in decorative painting, not trained to be a fine artist, as it were. And I think it's very likely that these kinds of albums, which Braque's father and grandfather would certainly have known, Braque knew them and might very well have introduced Gris to them. I'm also showing you in the center just a page, almost at random, from the Grand Magasin, showing damask tablecloths. I mean, there are endless brochures like this with this kind of material in it. But I chose this one because the tablecloth top right has the Greek key pattern, which you see in the watch to the right of the globe. And this kind of arrangement, it struck me, of the tablecloths, a typical kind of advertisement page from these brochures, has a curious look, with hindsight anyway, of collage, of overlaid papers. And it's also interesting to see that this common advertising device uses the kind of vertical, horizontal, diagonal grid, which is absolutely central to the style of Gris. So I think this is the kind of, I'm not trying to suggest that he was looking at this very page from this brochure, but I've looked at, I have to say, hundreds of these things online, and this is absolutely typical. It could be, I mean, there are endless copies of this kind of thing. So a kind of environment is created, it seems to me, in the still life imagery through the use of these kinds of common materials and a style which is modeled on the kind of workmanlike realism of advertisement. But the notion that you would read a work by Gris becomes quite explicit when he starts actually introducing readable pieces of text into his collages. And this happens a few months after those two works I've just shown you, in, for example, a work called The Book, Le Livre, of February 1913. And you get sort of quasi-dramatic situations being suggested through the combination of objects. Again, no human being present, but the implication is that there's a reader, not just us looking at the work, but somebody who was there in front of that table reading this book. And furthermore, the book itself introduces human drama. Now, in the case of the Livre, it was not difficult at all to identify what the book was. It is an early 19th century historical novel by an virtually unknown now writer called Roland Boucherie, and it's called Le Bourreau du Roi, the King's Executioner, a sensational historical novel, which probably Gris found the original book, because he's got the pages from the original book, on the quay in Paris or in a junk shop. He was a voracious novel reader himself, and he selected a passage, which the two pages are here, in which the evil king, Louis XI, is debating with his executioner, his bourreau called Tristan, what punishments he's going to inflict on the prisoners who are in a dungeon in the castle. And in particular, what awful things he's going to do to Berthe, the petite qui se lamente in the central part of the text. She's mentioned down here. And his plan is to get the executioner to drug her so that he can then rape her. So that's the story of the book. Spread eagled across the table in Gris's collage The book implies avid page turning, avid reading, and the wine glasses, or are there two wine glasses or one glass that's been moved from one position to another, the stimulus of alcohol. The wallpaper, which was used to form the curtain at the top of the composition, and so it's a printed wallpaper, I don't think that was a random choice, because the brutally truncated anemones, the flowers, mirror the deflowering of Berthe, which is going to take place a few pages further on. The setup of the composition, I think, is not totally dissimilar to this kind of illustration. Images of women published in expensive fashion magazine like the Gazette du Bon Ton, and sometimes also on the covers of the brochures, the department store brochures. Now, the elegant lady in a gown by Worth here is presumably reading something less steamy, probably looks like a book of poetry actually, than Boucherie's Bodice Ripper. But one is invited to speculate about her dreamy state of mind. What is she thinking of as she gazes through the window, which has, as you notice, a kind of flowery curtain, not unlike the curtain in Gris's collage. And one's invited to speculate about what she's thinking, just as one is invited to speculate about the backstory behind the book and the reader of the book in Gris's collage. Again, a situation which is similar to broaching the area of, if you like, genre painting, where stories are actually told by human protagonists. But in Gris's collages, the story is told by objects, by the book, the glass, the curtain, etc. The objects act as the protagonists. Now, at first sight, flowers on the left may seem like an updating of the ever popular genre of the flower piece by Fontaine-Latour, for example. And in fact, it was created, the bouquet was created with a mixture of two different wallpapers. I'm showing one of the wallpapers that Gris used, and little bits of fake marble paper, which are also used elsewhere in the composition. So he's creating the bouquet out of contemporary or slightly earlier wallpapers. But the pipe in the foreground to the right of the composition, a black silhouetted pipe, and the newspaper tucked behind the vase, we know what it was Le Matin for the 15th of May, 1914. The pipe and the newspaper are masculine props, whereas the bouquet itself is, of course, the sign for a woman, the gift to a woman, in fact. The bottle, there's a doubled glass, wine glass, doubled coffee cups, suggest the remnants of a couple's intimate meal, and the pink marble top, tabletop, which is formed from this wallpaper, but unfortunately, the history of that collage is that it was shown by Gertrude Stein, no less, above the stove in her apartment in Paris, where, of course, it got smoked by it's gone terribly brown. So you have to believe me when I say it's the same wallpaper. So that marble wallpaper suggests a console table or a marble-topped mantelpiece, something like that. And that suggests sort of a bourgeois environment or a tawdry imitation of such an environment, because, of course, the wallpaper is a cheap imitation of real marble. But I think the dark blue ground surrounding this, the deep shadows, the glinting highlights point to a sort of evening assignation for this couple. So that there is, in other words, the suggestions are there for a lover's rendezvous, and quite possibly, given the many, many illustrations that Gris produced before, in between 1908, 9, 10, 11, 12, many illustrations which are about illicit love affairs. The sort of sense of something illicit, I think, is there in the background. And you notice in these two illustrations that I've chosen from 1910, 1911, in the foreground of the one in the middle, you see champagne bottles, etc., glasses knocked over, the kind of scene that we're actually seeing in Gris's collage, and the bouquet of flowers, symbol for presentation to the lover, you find in both of them as well. Here again, what I wanted to make this comparison, where again you have, of course, the idea of an illicit relationship, in this case with a prostitute. You notice the man smoking in the bed, who looks actually rather like Gris himself, and the signature has a pipe. Again, that idea of the pipe is sort of the sign for man, as it were. Whereas the mirror, where the woman is dressing her hair in front of the mirror, that mirror, again, that idea of the sort of vanity, and maybe one can see the shape of the composition, the central composition of the flowers as mirror-like, and perhaps, in fact, the whole composition in its own way, a kind of form of vanitas imagery, the kind of the vanitas imagery that's so typical actually of Spanish still lives, it has to be said. Now, with the work on the left, cup, glasses, and bottle, a different kind of media is conjured up. The oak table with barley twist leg, which is constructed from the darker of the two fake wood wallpapers that Gris used, and the striped cloth under the white cup towards the right of the composition, which is a wallpaper with a rattan design. All those suggest a sort of domestic setting. It's difficult to know whether it's a dining room, a domestic dining room, or a cafe. But in any case, an unpretentious establishment with that kind of oak table would have appeared. To the right of the wine bottle on the left, to the right of the wine bottle, you will see a tobacco pouch with a carefully drawn flap and very neatly cut out of fake wood, a toggle. And this, of course, again, identifies it as a man's world where smoking takes place. Spanning almost the entire width of the composition at the center is a newspaper, which is given particular emphasis. And Gris even added a tiny slither of paper along its left edge at the far left of the newspaper to mimic the folding of the newspaper, an instance of his attention to minute details. The title, Le Journal, one of the newspapers that he used frequently, that and Le Matin, is very legible, of course, and you can read the date, Sunday, the 17th of May, 1914. It's perfectly legible, so that this is set absolutely, the historical moment is written into the composition. There's nothing universal about this. It's very time specific. However, the objects drawn, painted, or glued as cutouts over the newspaper conceal most of the text. And for example, the principal part of the actual front page was about the royal visit from the King and Queen of Denmark to France. Gris was a Republican all his life, and all the sort of kowtowing of the article is, of course, eliminated by him. It's covered over by the objects as if he's casting, sort of turning it aside, as it were. By contrast, he pointed to the story with the white spoon stuck in the cup here. he pointed to the other story on the front page, which concerned something called le train volant, the flying train, with a heading, ferons-nous bientôt du 600 à l'heure? Will we be traveling at 600 kilometers an hour? The visible text in the cutting that Gris used goes on to refer to the, I'm quoting, the sensational experiments performed in London over the past few days. And the story concerned an electrician turned inventor called Émile Bachelet, who planned an electromagnetically levitated railway, which wasn't built, surprisingly, but which attracted enormous attention worldwide when he held demonstrations in London in May 1914. And several articles in newspapers around this date recorded these experiments. And of course, they were recorded in London as well. Now, it's amusing, I think. I mean, Gris had a great sense of humor, as if possessed by the flying train's very spirit. Some of the objects on the table appear to be taking off. Indeed, there's a phantom glass, which you may barely be able to see in the slide here, which seems to have burst through the newspaper, leaving a sort of shard, a splinter of wood behind in its wake. And you have a sweeping diagonal thrust from bottom left to top right of the composition, which sort of echoes the train's velocity, 600 kilometers an hour. So you have a kind of clash in this composition, in the implications of this collage, between the story of the flying train, this absolutely kind of extraordinary invention, which of course we know never happened, and an absolutely banal tabletop scene with bottles and cups and glasses. Somebody reading this newspaper, reading this story, becoming extremely excited, if you like, and perhaps knocking over the objects on the table in his excitement. There's probably a strictly art historical context too, with Gris parodying the futurist, Italian futurist lines of force. And the idea of a flying train was, of course, absolutely up the street of the futurists who were very prominent in Paris at this moment. Now, to my knowledge, there are no photographs of Gris's studio in the Bateau Lanois, but according to Kahnweiler, it was a mess. And this is a quote: wooden walls with here and there bits of paper sticking to them, floors strewn with cigarette stubs and spent matches, two mean beds with broken mattresses, seatless chairs, tables daubed with paint and stacked with papers, empty tubes of paint and brushes. He was extremely poor. However, Kahnweiler says, on one wall hung a very beautiful hurdy-gurdy with marquetry inlay. Now, I'm illustrating a hurdy-gurdy from the mid-18th century, which may be a much better instrument than the one that Gris himself owned. But it's interesting that writers commenting on his meticulous collage technique have often felt compelled to draw an analogy with marquetry. And the fact that he actually owned a marquetry-covered hurdy-gurdy seems to me to be relevant. In cup, glasses, and bottles, the white cup and saucer to the middle, to the right, involved very fiddly procedures. He painted the parts overlapping the newspaper with white gouache, painting directly onto the newspaper, adding outlines and shading in Conti crayon. But the part of the cup which is visible within the interior of the lower tipping cup, the lower cup, that's actually a cutout. light colored paper, which he then painted with white gouache to make sure that it had the same color as the other cup. And then he worked over it with Conte. So it's incredibly detailed and careful. I mentioned earlier the little scraps of newspaper to the left edge of the newspaper, which he added to give a sense of the folding of the newspaper. And I mentioned the toggle created from a small cutout of fake wood paper for the tobacco pouch. All of this is an indication of his sort of artisan approach to the creation of his collages, the meticulous, craftsmanly approach, marquetry with paper rather than with wood, ivory, mother of pearl. But again, this is, if you like, this is artisan craft rather than, as it were, fine art. There's nothing approaching that diligent craftsmanship in the collages of either Braque or Picasso. And I'm just showing sort of random two works by those artists who were very close friends of his. Picasso in particular pretended, and it's a complete delusion, of course, that he was very careless. And he even pinned some of the cutouts rather than sticking them down. And I'm showing this one here from 1913, where there are two pins that you can see visibly that are holding the cutouts. And in fact, the other cutouts are also pinned rather than glued down, which gives a feeling of something absolutely provisional, that it could be unpinned and put in some other position, other composition, whereas you would never get that sense at all with Gris. Another of Gris's possessions, I think, deserves mention, and it's this lithograph here, a chromolithograph reproducing a painting by an artist called Charles Maire, which Kahnweiler saw hanging in Gris's studio in 1922, not in the Bateau-Levois. By that point, he had moved to Boulogne-Billancourt in the outskirts of Paris. But Kahnweiler saw it hanging there, and I'm sure that Gris had actually owned it earlier. Picasso also had a copy of exactly the same chromo before the First World War. Gris probably paid nothing for it, because these chromos in imitation wormwood leaf frames with their own kind of plate, advertising Pernod, fils, here you see it at the bottom of the frame, they were distributed free to bars all over France between 1880 and 1915, when absinthe was finally banned in France. It was banned earlier in other European countries than in France. And there was an entire factory devoted to the creation of these frames and to the lithographs, which were treated like oil paintings. They were varnished, they were mounted on wood, etc., and then distributed free. And Jean Cocteau, the poet, referred to these lithographs and argued that they lay behind Cubist collage, that the compositions with newspapers, bottles, glasses, etc., that you see in endless Cubist collages derived from this kind of chromolithograph, popular chromolithograph. Charles Maire himself was an amateur painter who came from a family of house painters, just like Braque. So again, it's this kind of down-to-earth artisan world that Gris is absorbing, if you like. And I think the style of rendition of the shading, the lighting, the representational style of this chromolithograph is extremely similar to what you're seeing on the left and that you've been seeing in the other collages I've been showing. And Gris is affecting, if you like, deliberately a kind of workmanlike style in keeping with the workmanlike, or the working class imagery that he usually deals in. The bottle of anise on the left-hand screen now, the left of the screen, another collage produced by Gris, which is in the Reina Sofia in Madrid. The subject here is a liqueur, of course, which is produced in Badalona, in the outskirts of Barcelona, from the late 19th century onwards. And in other words, it's therefore comparable to Pernod, the French drink Pernod. But whereas Mayer meticulously reproduced by hand the Pernod label, Gris simply peeled the labels off a bottle of anise and stuck it onto his collage. He took that shortcut. His hand-painted rendition of the faceted structure of the glass of an anise bottle, which is a sort of cubist object, if ever there was one, I think imitates the schematic three-color modeling of machine-printed wallpaper, which is illusionistic from a distance. I'm showing you a detail from the fake rattan wallpaper that Gris used in several collages. A blown up detail to show the kind of modeling technique that is absolutely typical of these machine printed wallpapers. And I think Gris is sort of imitating that, if you like, in the faceting of the bottle. And in fact, he pretended he was using wallpaper to represent the glass of the bottle by making the pattern lie completely flat rather than curve around the actual shape of the bottle, as it were. And giving those parts of the composition that render that glass the look of cutouts, whereas of course they're hand painted. Now it's been argued that the Anis del Mono label that Gris used carries a personal insider's message. The brand logo refers to the place of manufacture, Badalona, a suburb of Barcelona, and it illustrates two medals, one in Paris and Madrid, emblematic place names for the triumvirate of Picasso associated with Barcelona, Paris, Braque, Madrid, Gris himself. This has been argued, and I think it's quite convincing. Interestingly, those three places and three people are united in a kind of, they're friends. And it's also been suggested that the word anise looks and sounds like ami, friends. And also they're winners, they've won. But ironically, the newspaper, which you see a cutout of, tells us a troubling story of instability, disunity, and failure at a critical moment in France's history. The lead report, and you can see some of it, you can read some of it in the cutting that Gris used, is headed La combinaison Viviani a échoué. Monsieur Deschanel, appelé à constituer un cabinet, se récuse. Monsieur Delclassé, convoqué par le président de la République. The Viviani combination has failed. Asked to form a cabinet, Monsieur Deschanel refuses. The president of the Republic, who was Poincaré, summons Monsieur Delclassé. And although Gris obscured most of the heading beneath the facets of the bottle of anise, the word échoué, failure, failed, stands out, and one can read enough of the small print to gather that a political crisis involving René Viviani has blown up. And the fragmented composition, if you like, reinforces the idea of disunity in the outside world as against the unity of the three Cubists symbolized by the label. Now, politics is the backstory of many of Gris's collages, and one has to assume, I think, that contemporaries would have picked up more from the fragments that you see in the collages than we do today. We have to kind of go back to the newspapers and read them, which we can now do thanks to the fact that they have been digitized. So it's quite easy to do. And one can then, get the backstory, historic backstory quite easily. But I think it would have been much more present to Gris's contemporaries. And it's not surprising that politics takes such a big place in his collages, because he was making them during the months immediately preceding the outbreak of World War I, and in the weeks immediately afterwards. He was doing nothing but collage between the spring of 1914 and October 1914. And his own political position deserves more attention than it's ever received. And how one should read this, to what extent one should see these things as reflecting his political opinions, as opposed to just placing them there as part of reality, if you like. And the same would be true of the collages, which also refer to the feminist movement in France that was ongoing at the time. Many, many articles about the feminist movement were front page news, and he included scraps from newspapers like this. Subject also broached in his cartoons, but I haven't actually shown any of those to you today. Anyway, shortly after completing the bottle of anise, he traveled to Collioure with his partner, Josette Herpin, and it was there that he created the bottle of Banyuls, which you see on the left. About 10 kilometers from Collioure, Banyuls-sur-Mer is within hiking distance of Spanish Catalonia. But because Gris had never done his military service in Spain, he would have risked arrest if he crossed the border. And so French Catalonia was the nearest he ever got to Spain after he left Spain in 1906. The faux label, Banyuls, which you see in the collage on the left, is not a real label this time. It's a nice example of Gris's proficiency in lettering, which he probably acquired during his technical training in Madrid. And like the, again, faked Vin Rosé label in the collage on the right, it's generic. No producer is named, unlike the anise bottle label, for example, which does name the producer. These are generic titles, Banyuls, Vin Rosé. So they contrast with the clippings from the newspapers that you also see in these collages, and from the packaging, which you see in both of them, from the tobacco that he used to buy, the Scaffalati tobacco cube, which you see in the foreground next to the pipe in the collage on the left, and which you see to the left of the bottle in the Vin Rosé bottle. So whereas the one on the right, the bottle of rosé wine, clearly is a nighttime scene, very dark, very somber, the Collioure work suggests broad daylight, I think, drinking in broad daylight. Now, the objects featured in the bottle of anise are again male objects: the bottle of wine, the wine glass, the newspaper, the pipe, the tobacco. They evoke pleasurable relaxation. The fake rattan wallpaper that he used to form the kind of cloth of the table, as it were, or the surface of the table, and I'm showing you the wallpaper in the center top of the slide. That indicates wicker furniture of the kind that was associated with outdoor living in France, and a page from this time Aux Trois Quartiers advertising exactly that kind of rattan furniture, which was on sale in all the department stores in Paris and was always advertised in summer brochures, etc. And the hand-painted gray, blue, blue-green surround of the oval table with its objects has a kind of pointillist style, which is probably derived from the pointillism of people like Signac, and I chose to show a Signac painted in Collioure in the 1880s, suggestive of sunlight, sparkling sea, etc. The dazzle of sunlight. And the first letters that Gris wrote to Kahnweiler from Collioure express his delight in the charm of the port and the landscape there, which you see the port in Signac's painting. But interestingly enough, these signs of cheerful outdoor drinking, pleasant environment, sunshine, etc., are completely counteracted by the newspaper headline from Le Journal about a fatal ballooning accident in the Tuileries Gardens on the 19th of July, 1914. So the collage must have been made shortly after the 19th of July. A terrible accident brought sadness, as the quotation goes, as the balloons took off yesterday in the Tuileries. And what had happened was that the basket of one of the balloons had become detached from the rigging and had crashed near spectators, flinging out the balloonists who were badly injured. And in fact, it was thought at the time one of them was going to die, but he didn't. So the rattan wallpaper not only suggests rattan furniture, outdoor setting, etc., but it's also a reference to the basket of the balloon, which is made, of course, from rattan. And it's interesting that Gris used the displaced foot of the wine glass. Here, I put a detail here, foot of the wine glass, actually to highlight, almost like a magnifying glass, the word nacelle, which is the French word for balloon basket. So there's a kind of sort of punning going on here. It's typical of him, I think, choosing found materials, in this case, the rattan wallpaper, that would tell the human story, which is hinted at in the newspaper, and that lies behind what is otherwise apparently a meaningless, generic collection of objects. Again, this idea of a situation, of an environment being suggested, and of a human story, although no humans are actually depicted by Gris himself. Now, the collage must have been made, as I say, soon after the 20th of July, when the ballooning accident occurred, and probably just days before the declaration of war. So how do we interpret the black paper speckled with touches of white? Is this an allusion to the almost fatal ballooning accident, or to the war, the imminent war, or to both? In any case, I think that black paper introduces a sort of ominous note within the composition. And we know from Gris's very panicky letters to Kahnweiler at the beginning of August that he didn't know what to do for the best. Should he stay in Collioure? Should he return to Paris? How long was this war going to last? And in fact, the declaration of war had dire consequences for Gris. Kahnweiler was abroad when war was declared on holiday, and he couldn't, as a German and therefore an enemy alien in France, he couldn't return to France. He closed his gallery, and soon afterwards he was forced to discontinue his monthly payments, his contract to pay Gris a monthly stipend. And at the end of October, Gris returned to Paris and informed Kahnweiler by letter 2 weeks later that he'd now abandoned collage and was painting exclusively in oils. He was beset all his life, actually. He clearly suffered from depression, by terrible bouts of self-doubt, followed by inertia, and then kind of frantic working. That was the sort of pattern of his life. But on the 6th of March, 1915, he reported to Kahnweiler, "I think I've really made progress recently, that my pictures begin to have a unity which they've lacked until now. They are no longer those inventories of objects which used to depress me so much." He had apparently, I think, concluded that collage not only prevented unity because of the disparate nature of the materials that he used, but it also promoted the inventory approach to still life that had begun to depress him, the kind of inventory of ordinary objects from the department stores. And one painting, which is exactly contemporary with that letter, which registers the beginning of this change in method and goal, is the book Pipe and Glasses that you see on the left. It's dated March 15th, 1915 on the reverse, so it's exactly contemporary with that letter. Although its patchwork structure owes a great deal to collage, it's entirely hand-painted by him, and his consistent use of a kind of haloing around all the objects, this sort of white halo around every object, gives unity to the composition and to the surface. But so he's got this unity, but it can hardly be said to have escaped from the tyranny of commonplace objects. For here is a table laden with coffee pots, a coffee grinder, cups, glasses, a pipe, and a book. And the department store brochures don't seem very far away. In fact, I think, interestingly enough, the advertisement at the center top shows enamelware, enamel coffee pots with painted patterns on them. And I can't help feeling that that's exactly what we're seeing in the center of the composition here, where the coffee pot has that kind of floral pattern and a sort of spotted background, which is just like enamel. So I think that, you know, the department store objects and these kind of advertisements are still playing their role. And in the advertisement at the bottom, you've got the coffee grinders, which appear also in the painting. That said, you can't read the pages of the book in this painting. The script, you can read a chapter number, but you can't read anything at all. So you're not invited to kind of read the text or to situate the painting in a particular historical moment in the way that you were with those slightly earlier collages, which used newspaper. And I'm less aware of a kind of lurking narrative, less aware of a sort of genre situation, more really of a still life as an accumulation of objects, if you like, in this work than in the collages I've been focusing on. And by 1916, this is my final slide, Gris's paintings had become much emptier, much less specific in their decor, not so frankly tied to their historical moment, and more old masterish in their appearance. A violin is a very good example of this, a very beautiful, austere painting on panel, which invites a more kind of contemplative approach, less of a sort of reading approach, and moving away from that sort of sense of the genre scene, the narrative scene, the human story, really, that had been so important to his collage works.
Yes, excellent. Thank you, Lizzie. That was absolutely fantastic. I have to say, I don't think I've heard a lecture that was so seamless at such length for such a long time. Given my uncertainty around this technology, can I suggest we stick with the usual format for the seminars, which is that we, anybody who has any questions, please type them into the chat box and I will field them from there. Which means I'm afraid you won't see Lizzie again, you'll just get me, but I think that's the best way of doing it. Although we can maybe do a two-step. And I will take chair's privilege, however, and ask Lizzie the first question myself and say, could you tell us more about how this feeds into the exhibition in New York in the autumn?
What's happening to it?
No, what it will consist of.
Well, what it will consist of is collages, not only collages, it will consist of paintings and collages by Picasso, Braque and Gris. And also, because it's about trompe-l'oeil, it will also include trompe-l'oeil paintings ranging from mostly from the 17th through to the 19th century. Paintings that I can't swear that they knew, but that are absolutely typical of trompe-l'oeil painting generally. And so what we're exploring is the influence which has, or I should say the adaptation really, of devices from the trompe-l'oeil tradition that the Cubists made use of, very much in a kind of deflationary spirit, but also a form of identification. And I think it actually ties in with the sorts of things I've been talking about this evening, because trompe-l'oeil painting had a very low reputation. It was extremely popular with the public, and I have to say with collectors, including people in the very highest regions of society, kings, emperors, etc., loved trompe-l'oeil painting, but the critics thought it was the lowest of the low because it was so tied to the nature of objects, so materialistic, etc. So its reputation was very low in France at the time, and the only practicing of trompe-l'oeil that continued in France was in the realm of house painting, or I should say decorative painting, where it was thriving and continued. So that faking wood, faking marble was a very strong artisan tradition in France, all over France, at the period of the Cubists as well. And we will exhibit in the exhibition some of the sort of chromolithographs. I just showed you one, but the chromolithographs that showed people how to paint marble, how to paint wood, etc. And we will also show some of the wallpapers they actually used. I showed you a few of them. They will be displayed in a case so that people will actually see the sort of trompe-l'oeil wallpapers that the Cubists borrowed.
Thank you. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. Claudia, as always, is on the button. Is there any, oh shit, I've just gone the wrong way. Yeah, put your hand up. You're third in the queue, and then we should probably call it a day. From Claudia, is there any evidence that audiences at the time commented or dictated some of the coded meanings you have described? Thank you so much for such a rich and fascinating lecture.
Well, the answer is, don't know. That kind of commentary, that sort of recording of what people actually said about individual works, there isn't really anything like that. That has come down to us as studio conversation, etc. And as far as the critics were concerned, they did refer to the sort of artisan sources and references of Cubism. And it was understood that Braque was a very leading figure in this because of his background in house painting, house decoration, and so on. And he's praised for the democratic impact that he has brought into the contemporary art through these practices. So, but it's only in general terms, and in terms of the sort of interpretation that I've been talking about this evening, no, I can't think of contemporary references of this kind. Although, of course, people reacted to the use of newspaper and so on. But how closely Gris's audience read these newspapers, whether these stories resonated as much with them as one kind of assumes. I've got no definite proof about that at all.
Mark has a question. Could you say a little more on your research on wallpaper from this period? Thanks so much, Lizzie, for a wonderful lecture.
Well, the research in wallpaper, it was very simple. I went to the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, where I'm going again tomorrow. And I spent 4 weeks just looking at wallpaper. And that's where I found some of the very wallpapers the Cubists used, because the Musée des Arts Décoratifs happens to have the complete archive of a factory founded in the middle of the 19th century by Isidore Leroy. And they inherited that. And it was the biggest machine printing wallpaper factory in France. And it was just, if you like, by luck that I actually eventually found about 12 of the papers they used. By dint of, I have to say, absolutely fanatical looking.
No, that sounds like my kind of research. There's one more question for the audience, which I think I'm going to have to translate onto the screens. I'm not sure the microphone will pick it up. Susan.
Thank you very much. It was extremely interesting. And from a point of view of a painter, I've always loved bottles and labels and pieces of ephemera, which I've picked up on travels and brought back to London and incorporated paintings. And the thing about ephemera is that it disappears.
Yes.
And ephemera sometimes ends up being very valuable, precisely because it vanishes. And some of these things are so beautifully designed.
Yes.
So I love the actually found the image of Pontaglio very interesting. I've driven through Pontaglio many times on the way from Italy to London, and it's quite a wonderful plateau town, sort of in the middle of nowhere. Do you know why he put Pontaglio in the picture? Do you know why that's it?
Oh, because that's where Pernod was created.
Thank you.
Pernod was, Pontaglio was the center for the creation of Pernod. That's where the factory was. And so the newspaper is a sort of form of advertisement for Pernod as well.
Well, that seems like an appropriate place for us to end, everybody, because I think we all need a drink by this point. It only remains to thank you all for attending in person and online. And to finish with another parish notice, the final lecture of our Latin American series with Dr. Emily Floyd will take place next Wednesday as an entirely online event again. It will be given by Professor Gabriele Siracusano. I'm afraid I can't tell you the exact title, but I'm sure it'll be wonderful, and we hope to see many of you there. And thank you so much for your attendance this evening. Photo of the family.